Fellas, the scheme is straightforward. We're going to be taking a look at every single Master Duel N/R deck list that I think is viable in some capacity, and we're going to be ranking it on a tier list. The way how I'm going to be ranking these deck lists isn't going to be just pure raw, is this deck good, is this deck bad? It's going to be more about how I think the deck can perform over the course of an event, where some decks might be better just for grinding out ladder points, some decks are going to be overall better in regards to a longer tournament setting where you're playing it for like 6-7 rounds. So let's not waste any time, let's get to the first one. It is Adamantipator. Adamantipator is really cope. A lot of the cards do exist in pretty low rarity, the extenders, but the main power of Adamantipator mainly lies in the extra deck and the cards you're able to go into, plus the resource generation thanks to Block Dragon. And because the deck really has none of those, Adamantipator is kind of pigeonholed into playing like Stardust Charge Warrior control. You're not ending on anything significant, and your boards are just extremely lackluster for the amount of resources that it has to take. So overall, I'm going to be putting this in like dog shit. Unfortunately, this deck is just no-go. Next, we have Appliancer. Appliancer is pretty funny because Laundry Dragon is like weirdly good. Any deck that's able to end on a sort of monster that has some sort of protection, whether it be by battle, targeting, etc., is going to be playable in some capacity, but definitely pure Appliancer is something that I really wouldn't give my two shits about. It's just so weak. It just doesn't really function. There's just missing so many cards that make the Appliancer strategy viable, so that's why I'm going to be putting that in dog shit alongside Adamantipator. Off to a great start. Aqua Actress is like Appliancer, but better. You're able to use the Aqua Actress's cards to add certain very powerful Aqua Actress spells. Stuff such as Set, Aquarium are either battle boost, make your guards, towers, etc. And Aqua Actress is a really nice engine that if you supplement it with just like some good stuff, theoretically you should be able to get pretty far. Somehow this won a tournament. I don't know why and I don't know how, and I refuse to believe that that's a real thing. But it did top, and it's relatively consistent. Like any Aqua Actress card basically does the exact same thing. So that's why I'm going to be actually putting this in like the bottom of tier 2. It's not a terrible deck, and it's not like an amazing deck, but it's definitely a good deck. And speaking of good decks, we're on to Dragon Maid. Dragon Maid is... Scrub pilled me on this. This is a really good deck. Dragon Maid is a really good deck at just being able to generate a ton of resources, and although you don't have the access to stuff like Chamber Dragon Maid and any of the fusions, you do have access to just this recurable engine, very similar to Metal Foes, which we're going to get into later, and I think you guys are going to have some very strong opinions. And definitely Dragon Maid, if piloted correctly and you open well enough against certain matchups, I definitely think is a really, really strong deck. It doesn't always have perfect matchups against every single deck, where it definitely does benefit playing against Metal Foes. It definitely does struggle against a deck maybe such as Megalith. I definitely think that this is definitely a strong contender, and I'm going to be putting it in the upper half of tier 2. Next is DDD. DDD, unfortunately, is just not that good. DDD can theoretically shit out some of its synchros, but again, most of DDD's power lies within its extra deck cards, and unfortunately, most of those are SRs and URs. DDD can make Oracle King Dark, which is like passable, but it's not really that good. It's playable enough because of the contracts and just sort of generic staples, as well as just being super easily able to shit out a 2800 vanilla, but overall I'm gonna put this in like the bottom of Rogue. It has the potential to do things, but I just really think it can't really do much. Next, we have Dino Mist. Dino Mist isn't terrible. Theoretically, it's like a bad Metal Foes where you're using charge to generate resources and you're able to employ a sort of beatdown strategy, but just everything Dino Mist can do, Metal Foes just does 100 times better. I'm going to be putting this in the same sort of category as like DDD, where it's like playable, it's just not good. Next, we have FA Metal Foes. I'm just going to straight up call this deck is going to win the next N/R tournament. Because I'm going to be piloting it. This deck is very similar to Draco Metal Foes, where you're sort of trading in your board breaking power to set up a dumbass hang on mock floodgate that if your opponent can't out, you basically will just win the game on the spot. It's absolutely incredible what this deck is able to do alongside the Metal Foes. But the only issue that I have with it is that it does have some consistency issues. Some hands you're opening just a bad Megalith's hand, some hands you're just opening FA cards. It's just sort of the give and take of running multiple engines, as well as playing a deck such as Megalith's, where you're running like 6 search targets, and statistically you're just going to be opening 1. But overall, FA Megalith's I think is without a doubt probably the best deck in the format by a mile. Speaking of the best deck in the format by a mile, I think Generator, Gadget, Metal, blah blah blah, whatever the fuck Dyer is playing. This is just Gadget Rare. Easy tier 1. Easy tier 1. I don't think it will always top though. It is without a doubt probably, if you want to take it into the N/R solo queue sort of deal, it is without a doubt like a tier 0 deck. But if you want to play it in a tournament, I just think that the overall consistency issues that the deck suffers from, with playing 60 cards, with playing just like 500 trillion garnets, it really doesn't feel amazing to play over the course of long events. And just because of this sort of overall consistency issue and no way to really remedy that outside of maybe trying to cut the 40 cards and coping that it's enough, I really think that Gadget Raider, although is a powerful deck, I don't think it will always top, you know? But it is definitely, without a doubt, one of the numbered powered players within the format. Ghost Trick. That should say enough about Ghost Trick. Cosmo is a really interesting deck where you can play it alongside destruction-based engines, stuff like Fire King, which is awful, don't play that, it does like negative tier, plus Metal Foes. You could do some pretty cute stuff, and Dark Lady is a pretty powerful card, but unfortunately one card an archetype does not make. Although Dark Lady is pretty playable in its own right, unfortunately it just doesn't justify having to play like 7 other garbage cards just to turbo out 1. And for that reason, although I will put Cosmo in like the rogue category, I just don't feel like Cosmo Dark Lady is significant enough of a payoff in order to justify building your entire deck around it. There are other sort of supplementary engines that people have put in, stuff like the Dangers and a bunch of just like good stuff cards. But again, that deck is kind of getting carried more by the good stuff cards and making Dark Witch 1 in 5 games. Magispector is really cool. I really like this deck. It has applications within Metal Foes. You can play it pure if you really want to, but one of the biggest issues with Magispector is that it's very low impact. You're able to basically set up a bunch of spell trap interruptions. You're basically able to get free bodies onto the board, and these guys do have really powerful protection, being that they can't be like targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects. But the main issue with the Magispector is what's the payoff? The payoff is more or less condensed into the spells and traps, but unless you're able to always get access to them and just go off uninterrupted, as well as to always go first, Magispector unfortunately just really falls flat in that sort of scenario, where I just really don't like it. You can play this definitely in a Metal Foes deck as an engine with like 2 Bunbuku, 1 QB, and like a Tempest, or maybe like a Pop. But realistically, on its own pure, I really don't think this deck is amazing, but it's definitely still something that can play with the big boys, which is why I'm going to be putting it way above Aqua Actress, and we're actually just going to move Aqua Actress down. This deck is terrible. And yeah, we're going to put that in tier 2. Metal Foes True Draco. This is a very powerful deck. Kind of. So the main issue of Metal Foes isn't the fact that like the engine is weak, the engine's breaking, it's nothing like that. The main issue of Metal Foes is that you've kind of got like 10 to 15 other slots within your deck that you kind of have to fill up with like random stuff. Now the TCG, you were able to fill that up by playing stuff like Magician's Souls, Consistency Boosters, and in Master Duel stuff like Upstart and etc. But unfortunately in Master Duel, we just don't really have access to those cards because those cards are all SRs and URs. True Draco cards kind of let us cope with not being able to play staples by pretending the True Draco cards are staples. There are also some inherent synergies with the Metal Foes cards and the True Draco cards. You can pop the True Draco cards to act as staples, and of course to trigger Heritage to draw more cards. You could set combination and tribute a combination for the summon of a True Draco monster. But unfortunately, overall, I just feel like the deck is kind of just less better version of FA Metal, where although it's more consistent overall, it's just got a really lackluster turn 1 play. I think that the little sacrifice to consistency that FA Metal Foes has over True Draco in order for just a much higher skill ceiling skill and power ceiling, I think really justifies Draco being like a FA Metal being a tier 0 deck, and Draco Metal being like a tier 1 deck, probably right alongside Gadget Raider. Like, again, it's a very, very powerful deck, and it's probably like a top 3 deck. It's just not as good as FA Metal, you know? Speaking of decks that are not as good as FA Metal, we've got Marinces. This deck is terrible. You need to be opening basically like 3 extenders and like 1 play starter in order for this deck to do anything. It's actually miserable how bad this deck is. Like, oh my god, it's so ass. Obviously you can make like a big towers, but if you get your field spell spun by something like, I don't know, anything, or get destroyed by like Inut Garda, or just, you know, anything, it just feels so bad to play. This is the deck that really lives and dies by its field spell, but unlike something like Gadget Raider, you don't have any alternative plans outside of the field spell. So I'm gonna put this in like the top of like dog shit. It's better than Adamantimator at least, so keep that in mind. Megalith, I'm just going to tell you guys this right now. Megalith is still playable. I might be smoking a little bit of copium, but Megalith is definitely still a power player. Limiting a Fool and the same limiting a Bathor really does hurt the deck, but being able to still have access to like a Bathor pop on your opponent's turn, as well as if you open well enough, you having the ability to recycle your Megalith cards through the portal, as well as just, you know, cards in general, really does make this deck still, you know, a power player. It's nowhere as good. I will just tell you guys this right now. It is probably like the worst tier 1 deck, but it definitely does still have legs, or I guess stones, to stand on. It's a very, very powerful deck. Bathor pops are still amazing. Phaleg OTKs are still incredibly scary, and Fool is just the biggest asshole I have ever read. Tier 1, not amazing, but still definitely a powerful deck that you do have to still watch out for. Metalfoes Pure. This might sound weird. I'm gonna put this in like tier 2. Metalfoes Pure, again, it suffers from the fact that you're forced to play a bunch of random garbage within the 10 to 15 slots where you're not playing Metalfoes cards. You can play stuff like Book of Moon, Torrential, but the main problem with these cards is that they don't have an inherent synergy within your Metalfoes cards, and although you can technically cope and be like, oh, Torrential triggers my counter, oh, I can MST my own scale or combination if I really need to, you're more likely just going neg rather than doing any more impactful plays. That's why playing Metalfoes with another engine is almost always better. The only staple you should be running in Metalfoes is maybe exactly Forbidden Chalice, or like Smashing Ground to deal with like a Hang On Mac. Overall, this deck, Pure, while it is still very, very good, is just so underwhelming compared to the better counterparts, where you're able to play true Draco cards, which act as better staples and have more synergy, or the FA Metalfoes, or could sit on a dumbass Floodgate. Time Lord / Stall. This deck is like tier 2, where it's technically a deck. It's not good, but it's more just like the fact where if you open well enough with your Time Lords, you could basically just stall out and burn your opponent to death and just be that guy at the event. But the main issue with Time Lords is that you cannot win versus Metalfoes. It is literally impossible. Time Lords' main power comes from just, I don't know, sacking into back row, as well as the fact that not a whole lot of non-destruction removal exists within the format. Unfortunately, Metalfoes has a little card called Beryllium, so I don't know, you tell me. It's definitely got a ton of other stuff. It's just so bad. It's got like decent matchups across the board, but against Metalfoes, it's just unplayably bad. Against like Gadget Raider, against so many other decks that just have non-destruction forms of removal, this deck cannot win. And because so many of those decks exist in tier 1 and tier 0, I think that Time Lord is just like the bottom of tier 2. Like, it's worse than Magispector, and like Magispector is already like kind of cope. Pacifist. This deck before used to be a solid tier 2 and probably a tier, like a bottom of tier 1. And now it's probably dog shit. The main issue with Pacifist is that it's a very slow control deck. It's a very slow, methodical trap deck that sort of relied on your opponent not knowing what your cards do, rather than it applying its own pressure the same way something like Subterra might be able to do, where Subterra can generate its own plays. Pacifist is forced for your opponent to make bad plays over and over again and commit to boards while you're just sitting on like dumbass trap cards. And unfortunately, Pacifist lost two of its best searchable trap card, the Phantasm Spiral Battle, and this deck just went from like kind of playable to like absolutely terrible. Like this deck is unplayably bad. You can still play it with triple powers of power if you're bad and if you want to cope hard enough. But yeah, this is just so bad. It's way better than fucking Marinces though. Like, I'll just say that right now. Performapal, Odd Eyes. This can also be attributed to like Metal Foe's Performapal, but overall this deck just makes a Vortex strike. You make a Vortex and like you pray that's enough. It's not good. A lot of decks can push through one Omni Negate pretty easily. When you look at Metal Foes, you've basically got to negate that shit like 4 times. You basically got to like disrupt their plays rather than just flat out negating. And again, most of this format is based on disruption and 2-for-1s, 3-for-1s, etc. in the form of like Chalice, destroying a monster, in the form of like Torrential, getting a huge wipe, Pendulum summoning 5, Metal Foes countering. All these sort of plays are really, really powerful, and just because they generate so much advantage and resource generation, where Performapal Odd Eye is kind of just like, ah yes, I will set up my Vortex and pass. It's like maybe playable, it's just probably not good. Again, like there are just so little good Performapal cards. There's so such lackluster synergy with the Metal Foes that I really think that Performapal Odd Eyes is just not the way to go. Next up, we have Pure Gadget, which is, it's okay. It's Pure Gadget. You're just basically playing a less explosive version of Gadget Raider, where you're sacrificing a ton of power for a lot more consistency. And while consistency is really, really good, if your power ceiling is just so low, it probably cannot really accomplish much. Like, all Gadget really does is like make Malevolence in. If you cope hard enough, you could say like Heart of Dragon is enough, but you really need a ton of other stuff to back that up, which is why Gadget Raider is just so powerful. Although it may be like pretty inconsistent due to just like the sheer size of the deck and nombos and all that stuff, and inherent lackluster synergies between like everything. Anyways, me complaining about Gadget Raider bottom text. Pure Gadget, I'd probably put that at like the same level as Odd Eyes, where it's technically playable, it can technically do things, but it just seems like such a lackluster option compared to everything else. But it's still a very playable deck. Flip good stuff. MBT, stop trying to pill people on this deck. It is so ass. It is terrible. Do you want to lose to Utgarda? Do you want to lose to Mithrilium? Do you want to lose to Bathor and its bottom text? This deck is so dog shit. It is like Ghost Trick levels of bad. It is miserably terrible. Obviously, this is just a deck that gets carried by its trap cards rather than, you know, the deck itself. So, terrible. Dog piss. Ghost Trick level. Fuck it. Next, we have Pure True Draco. Pure True Draco is awful. It is bad. The ideal True Draco list looks like 3 of every single like True Draco monster and card that's not a Majesty Maiden, like 1 Maiden, and then just like 50 draw spells and like some floodgates. That is it. The fact of the matter is so many floodgates within NR format aren't really that good for True Draco to take advantage of, the most prominent one being the Monarch's Erupt, but of course with Apocalypse limited, no easy access to Apocalypse due to Dynamite and Diagram being limited and, you know, straight up banned in this format respectively, plus just the overall consistency issues that Draco suffers from only being able to play like 6 monsters that aren't good because they don't search Apocalypse. Yeah, unfortunately, this deck is just not very impactful. I think it could definitely top if you get Saki and lucky enough, but again, this is just, you'd have to get really, really lucky. I just don't think this deck has the consistency or power level to really be a mainstay of the format, especially when just Metal Foes can just laugh at like Monarch's Erupt, like, oh no, my effects are negated anyways, battle phase. This deck is probably like Rogue. I'd probably put it around like the Gadget Odd Eyes level. Tri Brigade is pretty bad. Most of the Tri-Brigade cards are like banned because they're SRs, and most of the Tri-Brigade targets are also banned because they're SRs and URs. Tri-Brigade you can kind of coke and make like Harvest Logger, or you can maybe make like exactly Harvest Logger. If you want to play Harvest Logger Control, it's funny. That's it. It's probably like dog shit. Yeah, this deck's terrible. Yeah, the Tri-Brigade engine is entirely available, but there's just nothing good you can do with it. Yeah, unfortunately, just Tri-Brigade as a whole is really, really bad in this particular format. And finally, Yo Senju Kaiju meme trash. This deck is so bad against every other deck that's not tier 1. This deck, if you're playing only tier 1 decks, if you're only playing like FA Metal Foes, if you're only playing like Draco Metal Foes, if you're only playing like Gadget Raider, if you're only playing Megalith, this deck might actually be tier 0. This deck might actually be tier 0. But unfortunately, that's just not how tournament runs work. Yosenju Kaiju is very much an anti-meta deck. It is very much a deck designed and built with the intention of beating these decks. But unfortunately, you're just not always going to be able to play those decks, which is why over the course of a tournament, I would probably put this in either the top of tier 2 or the bottom of tier 1. I'm realistically going to put this in like the top of tier 2 because Yosenju Kaiju kind of doesn't really have a whole lot of legs to stand on over the course of a bunch of tournaments that haven't played, and Yosenju Kaiju has kind of just never really been in that top 4 representation. But again, if you're only playing a meta, if you're allowed to switch decks in the middle of a tournament in like Top Cut, switch to Yosenju Kaiju and just like body every single FA player. Megalo, nice hang on mock, boom, Kaiju, normal summon, comma 1. Like, this deck is actually so funny against like top tier, but unfortunately against just like good stuff piles, this deck is just not good. But yeah, that's gonna be it for the tier list. This is objectively right because I do have the creds according to Danny. But yeah, it's gonna be it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching, and yeah, see ya.